In the year 1492, on a warm October shore, a group of European sailors watched something they could not explain. Men were breathing smoke, not from a burning hut, not from a wildfire, but from rolled leaves held between their lips, glowing faintly at one end, curling grey ribbons into the humid air. The sailors stood frozen. To them, it looked like sorcery. One of Columbus's own men would later write that it was impossible to endure the stench of it. And yet, within a single generation, half of Europe would be doing the exact same thing. That single, strange moment on a Caribbean beach was the beginning of one of the most powerful, most misunderstood, and most devastating substances in human history. A plant that would be worshipped as sacred, banned as demonic, taxed into empires, smoked in the halls of kings, and eventually proven to kill more people than every war of the 20th century combined. This is the story of tobacco. Not just a story about smoke, a story about power, addiction, empire, faith, and the terrifying gap between what we believe and what is actually killing us. Long before any European ship touched the shores of the Americas, tobacco already had a history stretching back thousands of years, hidden deep within the forests and highlands of the continent. Archaeologists have found evidence that the tobacco plant, Nicotiana, was being cultivated and used by indigenous peoples as early as 5000 BCE and possibly earlier. But this was not tobacco as the modern world would come to know it. It was not a habit. It was not a vice. It was something far more profound. To the Maya, the Aztec, and countless other civilizations across the Americas, tobacco was a bridge between the human world and the spiritual one. Priests and shamans would inhale its smoke during sacred ceremonies, believing it carried prayers upward to the gods and carried the voices of ancestors back down. In Maya temples carved deep in the jungles of what is now Mexico and Guatemala, stone reliefs still show priests smoking tobacco in ritual, their eyes rolled back, entering trance states believed to open doorways to other realms. Tobacco was not smoked casually. It was smoked with reverence, the way one might light a candle in a cathedral. It was used in healing rituals, in rites of passage, in declarations of peace between rival tribes. Some Native American nations would seal treaties by passing a ceremonial pipe from one leader to another, a tradition so sacred that breaking a promise made over that smoke was considered a spiritual betrayal, not just a political one. And yet, even among the people who revered it most, there was an understanding of its danger. Many indigenous cultures treated tobacco the way one might treat fire itself, powerful, useful, but never to be misused. It was reserved for elders, for spiritual leaders, for sacred occasions, never for idle, everyday consumption. This distinction matters because it is the very first thread of a pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout tobacco's history. A substance born from reverence, slowly stripped of its meaning, and eventually consumed without any of the restraint that once protected the people who used it. When Columbus and his men encountered the Taino people of the Caribbean, they witnessed something none of them had ever seen. The Taino smoked rolled tobacco leaves they called cohiba, and they also used a Y-shaped pipe called a tobacco, a word the Spanish would later mistakenly apply to the plant itself. Columbus's men, initially disgusted, could not have known that within decades, the very substance they mocked would become one of the most desired commodities on the entire European continent. It was a Spanish physician and researcher named Nicolas Monardes who, decades later, would write extensively about tobacco, praising it as something close to a miracle, a plant believed capable of curing headaches, toothaches, wounds, and even cancer itself. This belief was, of course, tragically wrong, but at the time, Europe was desperate for new medicine, and this exotic leaf from the New World seemed to offer hope for everything that ailed the human body. It was a French diplomat, Nicot, who would unknowingly attach his own name to the very compound that would come to define tobacco's grip on humanity. Serving in Portugal in the 1560s, Nicot became fascinated by tobacco's supposed healing properties and sent samples, along with detailed instructions on its medicinal use, back to the French royal court. He suggested it could relieve the migraines suffered by Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother of France. Whether or not it truly helped her headaches remains debated by historians, but what mattered was the endorsement. If tobacco was good enough for a queen, it was good enough for the aristocracy, and soon good enough for everyone. In gratitude, or perhaps in irony that history would only later reveal, the plant's active compound would eventually be named nicotine, forever linking Nicot's name to a chemical now understood to be one of the most addictive substances known to science. Word of this miracle plant spread across Europe with astonishing speed. Physicians embraced it, priests debated it, merchants smelled opportunity. Within just a few decades of Columbus's voyage, tobacco had crossed from a spiritual medicine used by indigenous priests into a commercial product being sold in the markets of London, Paris, Madrid, and Amsterdam. But not everyone was convinced this was progress. In England, King James I became one of tobacco's earliest and most passionate critics. In 1604, he published an extraordinary document titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, in which he condemned smoking as a filthy and dangerous habit, describing it in language so vivid it still startles readers centuries later. He warned that it damaged the lungs, blackened the insides of the body, and represented a corrupting foreign influence creeping into English society. It is a strange and almost eerie fact of history that a king writing 400 years ago, using nothing but observation and instinct, arrived at conclusions that modern medical science would not fully confirm until the 20th century. And yet, despite the king's warnings, despite heavy taxation, despite outright bans attempted in various parts of Europe and Asia, tobacco could not be stopped. It had already become something far more powerful than a simple crop. It had become an addiction, both chemical and cultural, and addictions, as history repeatedly proves, do not yield easily to warnings. Elsewhere in the world, the response to tobacco was even more severe. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad IV became so alarmed by the spread of smoking that he outlawed it entirely, and those caught defying the ban faced punishments as extreme as execution. In Russia, under Tsar Michael, smokers could face beatings, exile to Siberia, or worse. In parts of China, the Ming dynasty attempted similar suppression. These were not minor policies. These were governments treating tobacco as an existential threat to social order, and in hindsight, given what science now understands about its addictive power, their fear may have been more prophetic than paranoid. But despite executions, exile, and religious condemnation, tobacco continued its unstoppable march across the globe. Every attempt to crush it only seemed to make it spread faster, smuggled through trade routes, carried by sailors, planted quietly in hidden gardens. It is one of history's strangest patterns. The more forcefully something is banned, the more mysterious and desirable it becomes. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, tobacco was about to do something no ruler, no religious leader, and no royal decree could stop. It was about to build an empire, and it was about to build that empire on the backs of the enslaved. In the early 1600s, the struggling English colony of Jamestown, Virginia, was on the verge of complete collapse. Settlers were dying of starvation and disease at a horrifying rate. The colony seemed destined to fail entirely, until a man named John Rolfe experimented with a new strain of tobacco seed, imported from the Caribbean, better suited to European tastes than the harsh native variety. The result was extraordinary. Virginia tobacco quickly became one of the most profitable crops in the entire world. Ships loaded with golden brown leaves crossed the Atlantic by the thousands, and suddenly, the colony that had nearly starved to death was generating fortunes. Tobacco literally saved Jamestown from extinction, and in doing so, it planted the economic foundation of what would eventually become the United States. But this success came at a horrifying human cost. As demand for tobacco exploded across Europe, the labor required to grow, harvest, and cure it exploded alongside it. Tobacco farming was brutally labor-intensive, requiring constant attention through blistering heat, and plantation owners in Virginia and later throughout the American South turned increasingly to enslaved African labor to meet the growing demand. The tobacco industry became one of the primary economic engines that entrenched and expanded slavery in colonial America, decades before cotton would later claim that grim distinction. Behind every fashionable pipe smoked in a London drawing room, behind every fragrant leaf sold in a Paris market, there existed an invisible chain of suffering stretching back to plantations where human beings were treated as property so that a luxury crop could reach the wealthy of Europe. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in tobacco's history, and one that many popular retellings conveniently leave out. Tobacco did not simply build economies, it helped build and sustain one of the darkest institutions in human history. By By the 1700s and 1800s, tobacco had become deeply woven into daily life across much of the world, no longer viewed as exotic or mysterious, but as ordinary as bread or salt. It was chewed by soldiers on battlefields to calm their nerves. It was snorted as powdered snuff by European aristocrats who considered it a mark of sophistication. It was smoked in pipes by philosophers, writers, and revolutionaries who believed it sharpened their thinking. Tobacco had become so normalized that few people questioned it, and even fewer understood what was actually happening inside their bodies with every inhalation. That understanding, the true scientific reckoning, was still more than a century away, and when it finally arrived, it would arrive far too late for millions of people already caught in its grip. The transformation that truly turned tobacco into a global epidemic did not come from farming or trade, it came from a machine. In 1880, a young inventor named James Bonsack patented a device that could roll cigarettes automatically, at a speed no human hand could ever match, producing over 100,000 cigarettes a day, where skilled workers had once rolled only a few thousand. This single mechanical innovation changed everything. Cigarettes, once a laborious, expensive product, suddenly became cheap enough for anyone to afford. Tobacco companies led by figures like James Buchanan Duke seized this opportunity with ruthless ambition, building massive industrial empires and pioneering aggressive advertising techniques that would come to define modern marketing itself. Cigarettes were no longer just a product. They became a symbol of masculinity, of glamour, of rebellion, of sophistication. Carefully engineered images sold to the public by some of the most brilliant advertising minds of the 20th century. During the World Wars, cigarettes were distributed to soldiers as standard rations, believed to calm nerves and boost morale amid the horror of trench warfare and battlefield chaos. Tobacco companies donated millions of cigarettes to soldiers, creating an entire generation of smokers who returned home from war already deeply addicted, unknowingly carrying a habit that would kill many of them decades before any bullet ever could. By the mid-20th century, smoking had become so deeply embedded in Western culture that it appeared in nearly every film, every advertisement, every fashionable social gathering. Doctors themselves appeared in advertisements claiming that certain cigarette brands were the healthiest choice, an image so absurd by today's standards that it is almost impossible to believe it was once taken seriously. But behind the glamorous advertising, behind the doctor endorsements and the Hollywood close-up, something was quietly happening inside millions of human lungs, and the truth was about to surface in a way the tobacco industry could no longer hide. In 1950, medical researchers Richard Dole and Austin Bradford Hill published a groundbreaking study in the British Medical Journal establishing a clear statistical link between smoking and lung cancer. This was followed by further landmark research in the United States, and by 1964, the United States Surgeon General released a report that shook the nation, formally declaring that cigarette smoking causes cancer. For an industry that had spent decades cultivating an image of health, glamour, and sophistication, this was an existential threat, and internal documents later revealed during lawsuits in the 1990s showed something even more disturbing. Tobacco companies had known about the health risks and the addictive nature of nicotine for years, in some cases decades, before this information became public, and had actively worked to suppress, deny, and discredit the very science that could have saved millions of lives. This revelation remains one of the most significant corporate scandals in modern history, a story of profit deliberately placed above human life on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. What science eventually uncovered was staggering. Tobacco smoke contains thousands of chemical compounds, dozens of which are now classified as carcinogens. Nicotine itself, once believed by Nicot and monarchs to be a source of healing, is now understood to be one of the most addictive substances known to modern pharmacology, rewiring the brain's reward pathways within moments of exposure. The World Health Organization now estimates that tobacco use kills more than 8 million people every single year, a number that dwarfs the death tolls of most wars in human history. It is a devastating irony, almost too painful to comprehend, that a plant once used in sacred ceremonies to heal, to connect, to unite warring tribes in peace, became, through centuries of transformation, industrialization, and corporate greed, one of the deadliest substances ever consumed by human beings. And yet, the story does not end with condemnation alone, because history rarely offers simple villains without complexity. Modern science has continued studying tobacco and nicotine, revealing a more nuanced picture than pure demonization allows. Researchers have explored nicotine's potential effects on certain neurological conditions, though such research remains preliminary and is entirely separate from the overwhelming and well-established dangers of smoked tobacco itself. What is clear, without any scientific ambiguity, is that combustion, the actual burning and inhaling of tobacco smoke, is what causes the catastrophic health consequences the world now recognizes. This distinction has driven the rise of new nicotine delivery methods in recent decades, from patches and gums designed to help people quit, to electronic cigarettes and vaping devices marketed as safer alternatives. Though public health researchers continue to study and debate the long-term risks of these newer technologies as well, wary of repeating history's pattern of underestimating a new form of an old, familiar danger. Today, tobacco stands at a strange crossroads in human history. In wealthier nations, smoking rates have declined dramatically since their mid-century peak, driven by decades of public health campaigns, taxation, advertising restrictions, and a public finally armed with the scientific truth that was hidden from earlier generations. Graphic warnings now cover cigarette packaging in countries around the world, a stark visual inheritance of a truth once buried by corporate denial. And yet, in many developing nations, tobacco companies have simply shifted their focus, and smoking rates continue climbing among populations with less regulation and less public awareness, an uncomfortable reminder that this story, despite everything we now know, is far from finished. When you consider the full arc of this plant's journey, from a sacred leaf smoked by Maya priests reaching toward the heavens, to a substance that built and financed the enslavement of millions, to a mechanized industrial product marketed with doctors' faces and Hollywood glamour, to a public health catastrophe finally exposed through decades of concealed corporate deception, you begin to see tobacco not simply as a plant, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's endless capacity to take something sacred and transform it into something profitable, regardless of the cost paid in human lives. The Maya believed the smoke of tobacco carried prayers upward toward the gods. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest and most haunting prayer this plant ever carried was one for forgiveness, whispered silently by every generation that knew the truth and chose profit over it anyway. That is the hidden history of tobacco, a story that began in reverence and now serves as one of history's most powerful and painful warnings about what happens when we forget to ask what we are truly breathing in.